My father paid for my brother's entire MBA. Tuition, rent, groceries, even the car insurance on a lease he'd never driven a single kilometre to earn. When I asked for help covering my second year at Ryerson, he looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "You're the responsible one. You'll figure it out." 3 years later, he walked into the banquet hall at my brother's rehearsal dinner, shook hands with the venue manager, and froze. Because the venue manager was me. Not a guest, not a relative showing up to celebrate. The general manager of the hotel group that owned the entire property, the catering contract, and every staff member in that room. My mother grabbed my father's arm. My brother's fiancée stared at her program, then at me, then back at the program, her face going the color of the white tablecloths behind her. And my father, for the first time in my adult life, had absolutely nothing to say. I should go back. Because the moment itself means nothing without the years that built it. My name is Jonah, and I grew up in Mississauga in a house that felt divided in a way nobody ever admitted out loud. My younger brother, Spencer, was the one my parents talked about at dinners, at church, at every family gathering where relatives came through and asked how the boys were doing. Spencer got the longer answer. Spencer got the warmth in my mother's voice. I got described as dependable, steady, the one who didn't need much. That last part was never actually true. It was just easier for everyone to believe. Spencer is 3 years younger than me. Growing up, the gap between how we were treated didn't feel dramatic at first. Kids don't always notice the pattern when they're living inside it. I noticed small things. When Spencer wanted hockey gear one winter, my parents drove him to Canadian Tire the same weekend. When I asked for new skates the following year, my mother said money was tight. 2 weeks later, Spencer came home with a full set of equipment plus a new helmet. I remember standing in the hallway watching him unbox it, trying to figure out what I had done wrong. By high school, the pattern wasn't subtle anymore. My father coached Spencer's rep hockey team and attended every game in the province. I played soccer at a decent level and can count on one hand the number of times either of my parents came to watch. When I mentioned it once, my father said he had commitments. He was never too committed when Spencer had a game on the same weekend. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I told myself that a lot. The real turning point came the summer before university. I had been accepted to the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson, now Toronto Metropolitan, and I was genuinely proud of that. I remember setting the acceptance letter on the kitchen counter one Saturday morning, hoping someone would notice. My mother glanced at it, said that was nice, and went back to her coffee. My father nodded and asked if I had checked the mailbox, because he was expecting a package. That evening, Spencer mentioned offhand that he might want to go to Western for business. My parents spent the next 2 hours at the kitchen table, mapping out the application process, touring options, scholarship, research. My mother made tea. My father pulled out his laptop. I sat in the living room and listened to the whole thing from the other room. I went upstairs and did the math on my own. Tuition, residence fees, textbooks, transit. OSAP covered some of it. The rest was a gap I had no idea how to close. A week later, I sat down with my father and asked directly, not asking for everything, not expecting everything, just enough to close that gap so I wasn't starting my adult life already underwater. He listened with the expression he usually reserved for minor inconveniences, and then he said it. "You're the responsible one. You'll figure it out." I didn't argue. I had learned by then that arguing was pointless, and I think part of me had already suspected what the answer would be. I walked back upstairs, applied for every line of credit and student loan available to me, found a roommate through a Facebook group, and enrolled without telling anyone. Nobody asked. The next 4 years were the hardest thing I have done in my life. And I say that as someone who had since managed a team through a complete corporate restructuring during a global supply chain crisis. University-level hard is a different kind of hard. It's the exhausted kind. The kind where you're doing the math on your bank account at midnight before a midterm. Because you need to know if you can afford the textbook, or if you're going to have to share a copy with someone from your tutorial. I worked part-time at a Marriott downtown, front desk, then housekeeping coordination, then banquets when they needed extra hands. I learned things in that building that no lecture ever taught me. Meanwhile, updates about Spencer filtered back to me through relatives. My parents had set him up in a one-bedroom near Western. They were covering his rent, his phone bill, his groceries, and apparently a bi-weekly e-transfer my aunt mentioned once, without realizing she probably shouldn't have. I didn't let myself feel angry about it, or I tried not to. Anger is exhausting when you have 2 finals in a week and a closing shift on Saturday. What I felt instead was clarity, the kind that sets in when you finally stop expecting something that was never going to come. I stopped calling home as much. I stopped mentioning achievements. I graduated with distinction, and I told my parents the week before the ceremony. My mother said she wished she'd had more notice to arrange something. My father said he thought I had another year left. He had genuinely lost track of where I was in my own degree. I walked across that stage with my roommate's family cheering from the second row, because they had become more of a support system than my own. The Marriott hired me full-time after graduation, and it turned out that I was good at the operational side in a way that surprised even me. I understood the machinery of a hotel, not just the front-of-house polish but the logistics underneath it. Staff scheduling, vendor contracts, food and beverage margins, event capacity planning. Within 2 years I had moved into an assistant operations manager role. Within 4 I was managing a property. Within 6 I had been recruited to join the leadership team of a mid-sized Canadian hospitality group. Not one of the big chains, but a solid regional player with properties in Ontario, Alberta and British Columbia. I didn't announce any of this to my family. Not out of spite, at least not consciously. More because the habit of not sharing had set in so gradually that it felt normal. They didn't ask, and I stopped offering. Spencer finished his MBA, which my parents funded in full, including a trip to visit him during his exchange semester in Barcelona, and landed a decent marketing job in Toronto. He reached out occasionally. We were cordial. We had never been close enough to be anything more than cordial, partly because our parents had spent our whole childhood framing us as being in different categories, and that framing is hard to undo once it's baked in. The invitation to Spencer's rehearsal dinner arrived by email, because nobody had my current mailing address. I stared at it for a while. The venue listed was the Whitmore, which is a boutique event and hotel property in downtown Toronto that our group had acquired 18 months earlier as part of an expansion into the upscale event market. I had personally led the integration of that property into our portfolio. I knew its catering director by first name and had walked its ballroom during a post-acquisition inspection. I could have declined. I genuinely considered it. But I was curious in the way you get curious about something you've been watching from a distance for a long time. I RSVP'd yes and didn't mention anything to anyone. The night of the rehearsal dinner, I arrived slightly early and spoke briefly with the events coordinator, who recognized me immediately. A few staff members acknowledged me in the way staff do when the person walking through the door has signing authority over their employment contracts. I found a seat near the back and waited. My parents arrived with Spencer and his fiancée, a woman named Tara, who seemed genuinely warm and slightly overwhelmed by the logistics of her own wedding weekend. My mother looked the same. My father looked older, in the way people do when you haven't seen them in a year and a half. They noticed me and came over. Polite hellos. My father said I looked well. My mother said she was glad I could make it. The conversation lasted maybe 4 minutes before they drifted back toward Spencer's in-laws, and I watched them navigate the room with the easy confidence of people who felt they belonged at the center of it. That's when Spencer's fiancée, Tara, leaned over to look at the evening's program, the embossed one the venue had prepared listing the hosting organization, and her expression shifted. She leaned toward her mother and said something quietly. Her mother's eyebrows went up. Tara looked across the room at me, then at the program, then at me again. She came over alone. She said she needed to ask me something directly and hoped I didn't mind. I said I didn't. She held up the program and asked if I was the J. Hartwell listed as general manager of the Whitmore Group, because 3 weeks earlier, a contract dispute with the original event coordinator had nearly forced them to move the entire wedding to a different venue on 3 weeks' notice. The person who had personally reviewed the situation and approved an adjusted contract to keep everything in place, protecting the deposit, absorbing the rescheduling costs, had been someone with that name and that title. I told her yes. She stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "Spencer doesn't know, does he?" I said he didn't. Almost nobody in my family did. What happened next was one of those moments that feels slow and fast at the same time. Tara turned and said Spencer's name across the room, clearly enough that several nearby guests looked over. Spencer came over with a mildly confused expression of a groom being summoned away from a conversation. Tara showed him the program. She explained the contract situation, the name, the title. Spencer looked at me. I have tried since that night to find the right word for what was in his face in that moment. It wasn't simple shock, though shock was part of it. It was more like watching someone recalibrate a story they had been telling themselves for years. The version of me that existed in Spencer's head was the responsible one, the independent one, the one who'd figured it out. That phrase, "you'll figure it out," had apparently been repeated to Spencer by our parents often enough that he had absorbed it as a kind of truth about who I was. He had no idea what I had been building, because nobody had been paying attention. My father had drifted close enough to hear. I watched him understand what was being said. It happened in stages, the way comprehension sometimes does when information contradicts something you've believed for a long time. The venue, the contract, my title, the fact that I had, without announcement or drama, become the person whose professional decision had saved his favorite son's wedding. He didn't say anything right away. My mother touched his arm. Spencer said my name, which sounds simple but wasn't, because he said it in a way he never had before. Not the way you address someone you've been filed away from in your mental categories. More like someone meeting a person for the first time. I stayed for dinner. We sat together, which was not the plan. I had intended to eat at my assigned table near the back, but Tara quietly rearranged things, and I ended up at the main family table for the first time at a family event in longer than I could easily remember. The conversation was careful and a bit awkward in the way conversations are when everyone is aware of something unsaid hovering over the table. But it was real, more real than any family dinner I could remember from childhood. After the dessert plates were cleared, my father asked if we could step outside. We stood on the terrace overlooking King Street. The October air was cold enough that our breath was visible. He started twice and stopped twice. I had the strange experience of watching my father, who had always seemed certain of things, struggle to find the beginning of what he wanted to say. He said he hadn't realized. He said he thought he was doing the right thing, that Spencer had needed more support because Spencer had struggled more. He said he always thought I was fine because I never complained. He said he was sorry. I listened to all of it. Some of it landed as genuine. Some of it felt like the kind of apology, shaped more by the surprise of consequences than by a real reckoning with the cause. I had been around enough people in professional situations to tell the difference between someone who understood why they were wrong and someone who was sorry they'd been found out. My father was somewhere in between. I gave him credit for that much. I told him the truth because I had stopped being afraid of it years ago. I told him that the words he'd used, responsible, independent, you'll figure it out, had never been compliments. They had been ways of giving less while expecting more, and I had spent the better part of my 20s untangling the idea that needing support made you weak. I told him that I had figured it out, not because of anything he'd taught me about self-reliance, but in spite of the fact that he had treated his support as something only Spencer deserved. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't know you felt that way." I said, "You didn't ask." That was the most honest exchange we had ever had. It wasn't a resolution. It was more like a door that had always been closed being opened for the first time, with both of us blinking at what was on the other side. Spencer found me before I left. He looked like he had been thinking very hard about something for the last 2 hours. He said he didn't know what it had been like for me, and he was sorry that he hadn't. I believed him. Spencer has always been someone who, when confronted with something uncomfortable, tries to actually sit with it rather than deflect. I think my parents gave him that, partly. The security, to be honest, and I didn't hold it against him that they'd given it more freely to him than to me. That would have been pointless. We talked for almost an hour on the hotel steps, about childhood, about the things we each remembered differently, about the things we apparently experienced completely differently while living in the same house. He asked me questions about my career that felt like genuine curiosity rather than the polite relative kind. I answered them. At some point, someone brought us both a cup of coffee, and neither of us was sure who had ordered it. I went home that night to my condo in Liberty Village and sat with a glass of scotch and the quiet that I had spent years learning to appreciate. Not the silence of being ignored, which I had known most of my childhood, but the silence of having nothing to prove. The difference between those two kinds of quiet is enormous, and learning to tell them apart took longer than any professional credential. In the months after the rehearsal dinner, my father and I spoke more than we had in years. Not warmly, exactly, but honestly, which I valued more. He was retired by then, and had the kind of time to reflect that busy people rarely allow themselves. My mother called more often too, and I could tell she was working through something. Probably the gap between the story she had told herself about our family and the reality of what those choices had meant. I didn't push. I let conversations be what they were. Spencer and I built something new which sounds straightforward and wasn't. Years of existing in parallel, in the same family but occupying different categories within it, don't dissolve quickly. But we showed up for each other in small ways. He came to a work event of mine in the spring. I helped him move to a new apartment the following summer. We texted more than we'd ever talked in 20 years of being brothers. Tara asked me once, at a dinner the four of us had together, whether I had planned the rehearsal dinner the way it happened, whether I had known, when I RSVP'd, what the evening would reveal. I told her the honest answer, which was that I hadn't planned anything. I'd been curious, I had shown up. The rest had happened because it was real, And real things have a way of surfacing whether you arrange them to or not. I still don't know whether my parents fully understood what those years cost me. Not the money, I made that back and then some. The other cost. The years of calculating whether my achievements were worth mentioning, of editing myself down to the version of Jonah that was easiest for everyone else to accommodate. The habit of smallness that takes much longer to unlearn than any skill you can put on a resume. But I had unlearned it. That's the part that matters. I built a career in a field I hadn't even known I loved, discovered in the background of a job I took to survive. I built a team that I lead the way I wish someone had led me, not by calling people strong and leaving them to struggle, but by actually investing in them. I built a life that fits me, in a city I chose, on a timeline I set. The version of me that stood near the back of that ballroom, with nothing to announce and nothing to prove. That's who I had been working toward for a decade without fully realizing it. Not the general manager. Not the name on the contract. Just the person who had stopped needing the room to turn and look. That, it turned out, was the only kind of success that ever felt real.